Determine whether the following series converges or diverges. If it converges, find its sum. We have the arc cosine of 1 over n plus 1 minus the arc cosine of 1 over n plus 2. It should jump out at you that this is a telescoping series. So let's try it. Maybe it could be that it's not, but let's give it a try. With the telescoping series, what you have to look at is S sub n, which is called the nth partial sum. The nth partial sum can help you find what the sum is, if there is a sum. If this guy has a limit as n goes to infinity, then that number, that finite number, will be the sum of the series. So let's plug a 1 in and plug a 2 in. We could plug more in, but this thing ends at n. So plug the n in. So here's what happens when n is 1. Here's what happens when n is 2. Here's what happens when we have an n. This guy is the one right before it. Replace all the n's by n minus 1s. What do you end up with? A half, arc cosine of a half, arc cosine of a third. Arc cosine of a third minus arc cosine of a fourth. This guy right here would be arc cosine of n plus 1, and this guy right here would be arc cosine of n. And there we have it, arc cosine of a half minus arc cosine of a third, arc cosine of a third minus arc cosine of a fourth, and then we have those other guys at the end. And we have to see how cancellation happens. What you should do is write enough terms till you see your first cancellation. Mimic that for the last terms. That same cancellation should happen. Then any number that's going to be higher than the first guy who canceled, not higher as in larger, but higher as in that number 3, the next guy 4, and everyone above that will cancel. And so this arc cosine of a fourth will cancel. On the other side, anyone lower than n plus 1 is going to cancel. The cancellation would have happened beforehand. And so we have arc cosine of 1 over n will cancel with the guy who's before that. And you always can do a check at the end to make sure that the number of terms you have at the beginning should equal the number of terms you have left over at the end. And that's what we have. Let's go to the next slide to see what happens. So we have the arc cosine of a half minus the arc cosine of 1 over n plus 2 left over after all the telescoping, the cancellation of the middle parts. And we want to find the sum by doing the limit as n gets big on this. N gets big, so the denominator goes to infinity, but 1 over something that's very large goes to 0. Now you've got to figure out what the arc cosine of 0 is, and what is the arc cosine of a half. The way this question is phrased is basically backwards. What angle do you plug in the cosine and get a half out? The answer is pi over 3. What angle do you plug in the cosine and get a 0 out? The answer is pi over 2. And you need to subtract these. So you make each one of them over 6 times by 2 on the first fraction times by 3 on the second fraction, and you have 3 pi over 6 minus 2 pi over 6. Or I'm sorry, 2 pi over 6 minus 3 pi over 6 for a final answer of negative pi over 6.